Is Iowa a contender for the college football playoff in 2024? Yes or no? Yes or no?
Can I see the schedule?
Absolutely. We're going to look at the schedule. Yeah,
Okay.
let me share.
I
Let me
don't
share my.
remember the schedule off the top of my head.
Let me share. I bring this up because now that we've got an OC hired, I think it's a fair discussion to be had. We don't know
Sure it
exactly what
is.
the offense is going to look like, but let's talk about the expanded Big Ten. So here's the schedule. I'll blow this up, get a little bit bigger for people. So it starts with a home date against Illinois State. Okay, they'll be at home. Oh, we don't need to make our picks right now, right, Mark? But they get Iowa State at home. They'll be favored in that game, more than likely. They get Troy at home, tricky game, but favored. Unlike what your boy Mike Fort tried to convince us, Iowa is not going to be the underdog against Troy at home. Okay, that's not how this works. Then they play at Minnesota. Mark, I'm going to rely on you for insight on a couple of these teams. Minnesota, what have they lost a lot? I don't know much about the attrition that the Gophers have suffered from this offseason.
Well, they lost their quarterback to Rutgers, Ethan Kalkimanis. So he's willing to get into a quarterback battle against Gavin Wimsatt rather than stick around Minnesota, which kind of surprises me. They bring in a quarterback from New Hampshire who our buddy Daniel House is high on.
Okay.
But their defense was not of Minnesota's standard last year, and that's for sure.
No,
Wow.
it's not.
And,
So, and Iowa wants them back. Like, remember how bad that defeat was at home and how they lost? I mean, I know Cooper DeJean won't be playing in this game.
How did they lose? I don't remember that.
You don't remember how they lost? You're being sarcastic. So they should want them back. Now, I don't know if they'll be favored in that game, but this is a game that they'll have, I'm sure, marked in the calendar, and it's a rivalry game. At Ohio State's going to be very difficult to expect a win. Ohio State adds Will Howard. They're going to be really good as they always are. Mark, you're an Ohio State guy. I mean, can you really derive any optimism about a date on the road in Columbus?
Well, I give Iowa a lot of respect. I think they could go anywhere and put up a fight and win. So I don't want to just check that off. But Ohio State's loaded. They are, my goodness.
I'll tell you,
they had NFL draft decisions go their way, almost all of them, except for the ones that were just slam dunk. Like these guys all came back that could have played in the NFL this year. Plus, they are going crazy in the transfer portal.
So I guess the point is, I'm going to assume that's a loss. All right. I'll tell you where this discussion about Iowa's playoff chances comes to reality or fantasy. And it's games like the one on October 12th.
Yep.
The one on October 19th. Like neutral field against a Washington team that's coming off a trip to the national championship, but lost a lot. All right. They have lost a significant amount. Now they got what's his face back. Obviously lost their head coach, but who's the guy that was going to leave and then decided to come back?
Quarterback Will Rogers.
Will Rogers. So they get Rogers back. I don't know what he'll look like. I don't know what Washington's going to look like next year, Mark.
Iowa's a better team. I'm going to say this right now, and of course, I reserve the right to change my mind, that Iowa's a better team than Washington in 2024.
So if you win that game, you're sitting with one loss. What's Michigan State going to look like? That game's in East Lansing. It's probably not going to be an easy affair, but they've got a new head coach. And, I mean, do you have any insight on the Spartans?
Well, they've got a new head coach, and he brought his quarterback with him, and not the starting quarterback. He brought a guy that a lot of rating services, 247 included, rated as the most talented transfer quarterback, Aiden Childs, but he's very inexperienced. Michigan State, Jonathan Smith's a really good coach. They're going to be better, but they're not as good as Iowa. But then again, when you started off with the Minnesota comment about whether Iowa was going to be favored in the Troy game, I almost shot back, but then I bit my tongue because we're talking about Iowa. We're not talking about anyone else, because I almost shot back with, how can you be a college football playoff contender and not be a favorite against Minnesota and Troy? But this is Iowa. It's just a little different. Yeah, they're going to play a lot of close football games again.
But an improved offense should help them compete in more of those games. As long as Kirk Ferentz is here, they're going to play in a lot of close games. And Iowa fans shouldn't have a problem with that per se, because that is a brand that I think has gotten them to where they're at. But like I say, Washington, Michigan State, those are the games that, like, say you go 2-0 during that stretch, that is season defining, because then you have a very winnable game against an improved Northwestern team, but it's at home, and then a game back at home against Wisconsin that should be improved. But again, you get a rivalry back in Kinnick.
I'm going to have to see the rest of the schedule to see whom else they play, who's outside of the traditional Western Division, for me to make this comment. If this were 2023 and before, that Ohio State game would be important for this reason. Not that they would win the game, but that they would compete, because there would be that thought or that perspective out there that, okay, they went to Columbus, they got whacked by 40 points, and now they can go back to the Big Ten West and hide and win their 13-10 games for the next 5 or 6 weeks. But that is no longer really in play. So I think it is important to how well they play Ohio State, even if they lose the game.
Let me ask you this, and I know it's going to be harder and harder to have these types of conversations with a 12-team playoff, but if you had to predict with this schedule, with the conference, if Iowa goes 10-2 next season, are they in the playoff?
Yes.
Okay, so if they're in the playoff at 10-2, what are the chances they're in the playoff at 9-3?
About 30%.
That's, I mean, given what Iowa has done lately, Mark, like, I know that the schedule gets tougher. Yes, the schedule gets tougher. All right. Got a new offensive coordinator. I don't know. Like, I think
look at it this way.
The goal.
As soon as the Big Ten schedule was released, this is how I slice it up, and this is just how I analyze things. I basically took every team in the Big Ten, but specifically the Western Division teams, and said, okay, this is what a standard schedule looks like currently, and now let's transfer it and see what games are being replaced with what games to see how much more difficult this schedule is. So Iowa is playing how many teams from the current East? Ohio State, Maryland,
Michigan State.
3. So they're only playing one more.
No, they're only playing
one more than they used to.
Yes, correct. Yeah. One more than they used to. Yes.
So look at it this way. Let's say they're replacing, this would be a season they're playing Ohio State and Maryland. They're replacing Michigan State, Washington, and UCLA for the 3 teams that they are not going to play in the former Big Ten West.
Well, hold on a second. They played 3 crossovers in the former Big Ten West.
Oh, what am I thinking of? I'm thinking of every other conference in America. Okay, so that you're basically then just supplanting UCLA and Washington with whomever they don't play out of the previous Western Division.
Well, that's significant, though.
That's Illinois and Purdue, right?
No. Yes, it's Illinois and you got it, Purdue.
So there it is. They're replacing Purdue and Illinois with UCLA and Washington.
At UCLA, home Washington, and that East schedule is at Ohio State, at Michigan State, and at Maryland. What do you mean? Three road trips?
They're 3 road trips, but that's pretty balanced in terms of playing the upper division, the lower division.
Okay. Well,
it's not like you're loading up with all 3 or 2 of the 3 difficult teams over there.
And it's also balanced. The simple fact that it is across the board this way. Like, this is how the schedule shapes up for basically all Big Ten teams. And that's what I appreciated about how the new modern revised Big Ten schedules are orchestrated, is they're organized for balanced purposes. So, I mean, in case you missed that, last 3, if you're listening on the audio version later, last 3 games of the year at UCLA, at Maryland, and home Nebraska. And here's one thing that I would say about the schedule, Mark. This might be the first year where I'm looking through the schedule and I'm thinking there are no automatic wins after the non-conference. None. Like, not that there are, I know Kirk would never admit that there are automatic wins, but in a lot of years, home against Northwestern, home against Illinois, those are pretty much wins. Home against Indiana. I mean, what are their
Yeah,
easiest games in the Big Ten? Home against Northwestern? I mean, Northwestern just went what, 9-4,
8-5, but yeah,
8-5, and then okay, home against Nebraska, and who knows what the Cornhusker is going to look like by Black Friday, second year under Matt Rule. I mean, they may not be
yeah.
very good. They may be the most vulnerable team on the schedule, but we don't know that. Um, and Wisconsin didn't look all that great, and they finished what, 8-4 or 8-5.
Iowa is missing a lot of the very worst in the Big Ten, but they're also missing the very best of the Big Ten. There's no Michigan, no USC, no Penn State. There's also no Purdue, Illinois, Indiana.
There's no Oregon.
There's no Oregon. Yeah. So they're they're doing okay on top. And for people that don't watch me on a regular basis, I'll just back up the 10-2 versus 9-3 in that I'm not just spitballing that. Like, I've looked through the last 15 years, and especially the last 10 years are credible because there were actual playoff rankings submitted by the committee, of course, to say, okay, how would this translate to the 12-team playoff? And I've gone through again about 15 years, and 10-2 guarantees you are going to be in the playoff. 9-3, yeah, most of these teams are left out, but not. This is where the schedule would come into play, and the impressive or lack thereof nature of the games in terms of wins and losses.
This is going to take some time for fans to get used to the term playoff, because it's totally, when you expand from 4 to 12, it's not like expanding the NCAA tournament from 64 to 68. It totally changes how we view the postseason. And I think in a good way. Some people would say it makes the regular season less consequential. I couldn't disagree more. I've never understood that line of reasoning, Mark, that we want a smaller playoff because it makes games in the regular season that much more important. When teams get one or two losses, or when they got one or two losses, you could argue the rest of the schedule didn't mean anything at that point under that frame of logic. So why would you not want more teams competing for potential playoff spots late in the year? And that's what you have now with the 12-team playoff.
So when people make that claim about it lessening the regular season and making it meaningless, they're right about 10% of the time. And you and I and the people that fight for it makes the regular season more meaningful are right about 90% of the time in this way. The first batch of games, there will be games that are going to be rendered somewhat meaningless that would have been crucial to a team reaching the playoffs in a 4-team model, because the teams are so good that it doesn't matter. That Ohio State and Michigan are 11-0 at the end of the season and the loser's still in the playoff. Those kind of games.
But when we think about that logically, Mark, do we really want a scenario? Is it a healthy scenario to have a one-loss Ohio State team, one game they lost this year, keeps them out of the playoff? I think that's ridiculous. But again, going back to the other side of that argument, I guess it puts a great importance on a de facto quarterfinal matchup between Michigan and Ohio State. I get that.
Yeah, so the point I'm making is there are going to be a handful of games, depending on the season, where you can just say they're the number one team in the country. They don't need to win their last game of the season. This is a meaningless game for them, where everything would have been riding on the line, or they were a one-loss team that could lose a second game, as opposed to dozens of games, dozens and dozens of games across the country now have meaning.
Correct.
When Iowa's 7-2 in week 10 and they are playing an 8-1 USC team 2 years from now, that game's going to be mammoth. Whereas if I was 7-2, they're not making the playoff, a 14 playoff. They're done. They're not going.
And I understand. I think some people look at it from the perspective of, we don't want college football to turn into what college basketball is,
Or the NFL.
Well, or the NFL. But I mean, like, a lot of people love the college basketball regular season and the NFL regular season. I'm infatuated with college basketball throughout the year. And if there's a team that's, near 500 that has a chance to play their way into the NCAA tournament during conference championship week, so be it. I'm excited to watch it. I just have never understood that line of thinking that we want to just quickly eliminate teams. If we have that line of reasoning, why don't we just have a single elimination playoff at the very start of the year? Why play the regular season at all? If we just want every game to be quintessential, then just make it single elimination from week 1 on. And you can just you just have one big playoff. You could just have the playoff start in week 1.
Well, we are going to possibly run into, unless the power brokers in this sport are broken up, we are looking at possible rematches in third games. And I don't know how well that's going to sit with people. But I'm willing to put up with the rarity of that happening versus the benefit.
Well, it's not going to be rare with Ohio State and Michigan, right? That's not going to be rare. I think it's going to be weird. I think it's going to be strange. I don't know what to think about it, frankly. I don't know what the solution is. I think the most reasonable solution from a non-Ohio State Michigan fan is, why don't you just play the game in early October? But I'm guessing a lot of Michigan fans and Ohio State fans don't want to do that. I get it. It's part of the culture of the game, but who wants to see that game back to back year after year? But I also don't know that I don't know that you can say that with the quality of teams entering this conference.
Exactly.
I don't know how often that's going to happen.
Yes.
But boy, it would have happened a lot over the past. How many years would it have happened here?
Well, they would have played 3 straight.
Yeah,
the last 3 years.
Yeah.
And then I think also, not to get off the Iowa track, but then in situations like that, there's also a fear that a team's going to enter that game having already reached the conference championship game, even with a loss. Therefore, you've taken away their incentive to win what's supposed to be the biggest game of the year, because they're going to have to play those guys next week anyway.
That's what I'm saying. Exactly.
But like you say, with the 4 new teams entering the Big Ten, that should break up the power and distribute the power a little bit more evenly.
There are other rivalries that last week. So without divisions, like Iowa plays Nebraska. I'm not saying they're ever going to be top of the conference, but that is there, right? That the potential for a back-to-back. Can you imagine Iowa and Nebraska in 2024 play for the Big Ten championship? USC, UCLA is USC and UCLA, aren't those? Isn't that game played the last week of the season? That's a little bit more reasonable.
Every other year, yes.
Okay, what's the other one? Every other year.
Every other year. That's the last game of the season. It's very odd, but when Notre Dame travels to USC, they play the last game of the season.
Okay. So there are other. Maybe it's going to be Minnesota and Wisconsin. Maybe that will be the rematch. Or is it Northwestern Illinois?
You need to bring Northwestern Illinois. You need to bring Steve Dace on here, because he just thinks that he's got a list of teams that are basically locked out of the Big Ten championship game.
I made the comment to someone last night. I said, it's probably like, could I see Iowa never winning another Big Ten championship? Never is a strong word, but man, it's going to be pretty hard just to get there. I mean, I could see Iowa not ever making the Big Ten championship game again.
But making the playoff.
That's what I'm saying. Like, teams talk for so long, coaches have talked about conference championships first. I don't think you do that anymore, do you? I just don't think you can. I don't think that's fair to the players. You know, unless we want to have that as the hierarchy, like, hey, our goal is a Big Ten championship, and if eliminated from contention there, our next goal is the playoff. Like, man, I don't know. That'll be interesting to see. And I know there's some coaches that aren't so championship focused with their lingo, but man, the 12-team playoff, like you said, 9-3 potentially get you in.
We almost saw our first hint of this 2 years ago when Ohio State played Georgia in the playoff. If they would have made that field goal, won the national championship, then there would have been this, well, they didn't win the Big Ten. They didn't beat Michigan. They still won the national championship. So for programs like Iowa, I think Penn State they are the poster child for this. They would have benefited the last 10 years more than any program in the country with a 12-team playoff.
How many times would they have made the playoff if it was a 12-team playoff?
2016, 17, 19, 22, 23.
That doesn't mean they would have won a national title, but boy, that's a lot of tries.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It will be interesting. Yes, Iowa, they are a playoff contender.
Well, I'll take it from the source, from the voice of college football. So I agree. I agree. I mean, but again, this spring is going to be so important for development, specifically at quarterback, and we're still waiting an official announcement from Iowa on not only Lester but on the wide receiver coach to be, because Kelton Copeland's out. So still things to follow. And then next week we're going to talk about ranking the quarterbacks from the Kirk Ferentz era. So that should be fun.
We'll mark that down. Everyone make it back. We will rank the Kirk Ferentz era quarterbacks at Iowa. So that'll be our first in a series of special content here during the off season.